Most of what we believe about the best ways to study are absolutely false. Whatever you believe about how best to learn is probably incorrect. The best learning practices are not intuitive. Fortunately, today you will learn the best ways to study. I think it's nice to think about a more recent study of how best to study. And this study looked at whether or not studying material 4 times, so study, was better in terms of locking that information into people's minds, allowing them to use that information flexibly, which is an element of creativity, essentially giving them mastery of the material, than a different group which studied once, studied the material twice, studied the material 3 times, then was tested on the material, or a third group that studied material once, then took 1, 2, 3 tests on the material. Now, so what I just described was 3 groups, all of whom read a passage. This was a passage about animals, about biology, some other topics too in different experiments. Again, 3 groups. One group studies 4 times. They study the material 1, 2, 3, 4 times. Then later, they take a test. The second group studies 1, 2, 3 times, takes a test on that material, and then later takes a test. The third group studies the material once, then takes 3 tests on the material, and then later takes a test. So what's analyzed and compared between these different groups is their performance on that final test. Think about it as SSSS, so study, and then later test, or SSST, study, test, and then later test, or STTT, study, test, and then later test. So what's compared and contrasted is performance on the test some period of time later. The point here is twofold. First of all, you can probably guess who performed best on the test that occurred some period of time later, okay? The performance on that final test was essentially proportional to the number of tests one had already taken on the material. So the more tests that you take as a way to expose yourself to the material, the better you're going to perform on that material at some later point. Now, of course, at some point you have to be exposed to the material for the first time, right? That's why it's studying and learning. But after one exposure to new material, taking more tests on that material, even if you don't perform that well on those tests, as long as you're able to see the accurate answers to those tests and compare your answers to those answers, will lead to better performance on the ultimate test and retention of that material at some later time. Put differently, it's not about how many times you study the material or how many times you're exposed to the material. It's about being exposed to the material, doing your best to focus and attend to that material, and then self-testing yourself on that material. Or as the case may be, if an instructor is the one giving you the test, but nonetheless taking tests on that material, not just once, but ideally 2 or 3 times. That's what really locks the material into your neural circuits. That's what's going to lead to the most pervasive change, the most durable change, we should say, in your neural circuits that carry that material, that hold that material in your mind, what we call neural encoding. The more times you test yourself or that you are tested on material, the better your retention of that material. Now, some people will immediately say, well, goodness, what if I learned it and then I'm tested and I'm somehow consolidating the wrong or inaccurate material? But it doesn't appear to be the case. As long as you learn what the correct answers to the tests are, even if you're getting, 40 or 50% or less accurate on those tests that you take immediately after the studying period, that's still going to be a better strategy than rereading the material, which ought to be somewhat surprising. It certainly was surprising to me. But you know what's even more surprising and a little scary, and that we all should know, and I wish I had learned when I was in the 2nd grade, is that if you ask students, how confident are you in the material that you just learned? How well do you think you would perform on a test? What you see consistently in these studies, I'm chuckling because it's kind of mind-blowing, is that the students who study the material, that is, who are exposed to the material 4 times, think that they are going to perform best on the ultimate exam. However, the students that study the material once and then are tested 3 times on that material, they think that ultimately they're going to perform least well. For instance, they ask them their confidence, how well do you think you would perform on a test of this material in 2 weeks, or in a year, or in 6 months, or even tomorrow? They report, that is, the students in the study test group report much lower confidence in the material, much lower sense of mastery of the material compared to the students that were exposed to the material 4 times, who are saying, yeah, I think I would do pretty well or very well. And guess what? The exact opposite is true. Put differently, when you're exposed to material over and over and over again, you think you've learned the material. In fact, your confidence that you've learned the material increases with each subsequent exposure to the material. But actually, you haven't learned it at all compared to the people that are exposed to the material and then take tests on the material, oftentimes straining to get the answers right on those tests. In fact, sometimes getting those answers dead wrong, and then realizing they get those answers dead wrong, or sometimes they just sense it. But guess what? Testing yourself once, twice, maybe 3 times prior to the ultimate test of your knowledge of that material is far and away the best way to lock that material into those neural circuits.